Morning, everybody, on this chilly Johannesburg morning. Uh, it's chilly, yes, but sitting here in the sun, it's actually quite comfortable. And I think about how uncomfortable it must have been for Jonah at this part of the story. We pick up the story in Jonah chapter 2 after he's been hurled overboard by the sailors who thought rightly that he was the cause of this storm. And God actually did still the storm the moment he hit the water, but he sank like a stone and was swallowed up by a great fish. And it starts in Jonah chapter 2. It says, "From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God." So the first encouragement that I see here is that there's no place you can go where your prayers will be unheard. There's no place you can go to or be physically, geographically, mentally, or spiritually where God can't hear your prayer. We can imagine what the inside of the fish might have been like. Can you imagine the smell? Was it a sizable cavity that he could move around in inside the fish, or was it a tight squeeze? We don't know. There seems to have been an air pocket that allowed him to breathe and live. And so in that state, he prayed a prayer of thanksgiving. In verse 2, he said, "In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry." And this song or prayer that Jonah prays reads a lot like the Psalms, and Jonah was obviously well acquainted with the Psalms. And in Psalm 34, there's a similar cry in many places in the Psalms. In Psalm 34, it says, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and the crushed in spirit. And so that's the second encouragement. If that's you, if you're in a place where you're feeling lowly and brokenhearted, the Lord is near. The Lord is near. Verse 3, it says, "You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and your breakers swept over me." Hang on, didn't the sailors throw Jonah into the sea? But here he says you, he's praying to God, he says, "You hurled me into the depths." And Jonah rightly acknowledges that it was actually God who threw him into the sea. Do you trust in God's loving and strong hands behind everything that happens in your life? That he both leads you and will sustain you through thick and thin. In that moment where Jonah struck the waters, knowing that it was God who had him in the situation, he cried out to God in that moment for mercy, and God answered. Verse 4, he says, "I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple." And Jonah's thanking God for saving him, even though he's still got a long way to go. He's still inside the fish. He hasn't been saved and put into a comfortable situation, but he has been delivered from death, and his fears have been replaced with a hope in God's faithfulness to see him through until that day when he can again worship in the temple. God saved him from death, not now to just die in the fish, and he had to trust in God for that he was saved from the waters, and that he wouldn't be left here to die. But he had faith that God would raise him up again from the belly of the fish for redemption, for the purpose of God's glory, for the purpose of more people hearing the message of God, not just to now let him die in that belly of the fish. Verse 5, "The engulfing waters threatened me, the deep surrounded me, seaweed was wrapped around my head." I mean, what a picture. He obviously sank like a stone. I see that scene from the end of the first Lord of the Rings film where Samwise is sinking in the lake and just sinking like a stone. It says, "To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord, my God, brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them." And that's a powerful picture right there. An idol is anything that might take God's rightful place in our lives. We always have this choice. We can either cling to idols or we can turn to God and his love. There's no middle ground or no third option. May we cast away our idols. God help us. God help us to expose the foolishness of idolatry, even showing others that God's love is greater and ultimately satisfying and eternally fulfilling, much more so than any idol could ever be, with its fleeting enjoyment that it brings us. Verse 9, it says, "But I with shouts of grateful praise will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will make good. I will say salvation comes from the Lord." And that statement, salvation comes from the Lord, is at the midpoint of the book of Jonah. And it's fitting that it is, because it's the key idea in this book of Jonah, the theological foundation of this book of Jonah. Salvation comes from the Lord. And God demonstrated that to undeserving Jonah. Jonah had been disobedient and actually deserved wrath. But God demonstrated his salvation to undeserving Jonah. And God will demonstrate it to whomever he chooses to show that salvation. He was going to show that salvation comes from the Lord, and he was going to show that to the city of Nineveh as well. And this ought to be the driving message of our lives to family, friends, colleagues, neighbors, communities, nations. Salvation comes from the Lord. Let that be our driving message of our lives as we seek to share that with others. Verse 10, "And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land." And last time in the previous devotional, Jan pointed out that Jesus himself associated with Jonah. When the people asked for a sign, he said the only sign he would give them would be the sign of Jonah. And as Jan said, it was a reference to Jesus' own death and resurrection. Jonah was a sinner guilty of disobedience, who was swallowed up and saved at the brink of death, so that he could fulfill the mandate to preach to the Ninevites the reality of their sin and the need for God's salvation. Jesus is the one greater than Jonah, who never sinned, yet was swallowed up by death for our sakes, the punishment we deserve. And at God's command, death itself gave Jesus up, God raising him up, not just from near death, but from a literal physical death and from a separation from God. Jesus resurrected and exalted to the highest place at God's right hand. And this was to save many to the glory of God. Jesus saved not only a great city, but all men and women across the globe, down through all generations, who would call on his name for salvation. And it was so that we could fulfill the mandate to go into all the world, preaching the gospel to all creation, teaching them to obey all he commanded. And surely he will be with us always. So I hope that encourages you today, that you can pray from any location, any spiritual state, any mental state. God hears your prayers. That we have this message and this mandate that salvation is from the Lord, and that should be the message of our hearts and our lives. And we have a firm foundation in Christ, the one greater than Jonah, who gave his life to save us and was raised from the grave, even as Jonah was saved from the near-death experience that he went through for the salvation of that city. Let us join with Christ and in obedience fulfill this mandate that he has given us. God help us. Bless you.